They disowned me for being gay. My parents said, "You were a disgrace to us." But why did you come to say goodbye first? I am their only son. They kicked me out for who I was, and then they begged me to stay by my side before they died. Many years later, I was the only one who visited them in the hospital. Then they said, "We've always loved you, just not like this." I held his hand when he was dying. He was trembling, his face pale, and his voice barely above a whisper. "We've always loved you, just not the way you wanted." Those words, they didn't surprise me. They didn't sting the way they should have either. They were just another hollow statement in a life full of empty promises and broken expectations. His frail fingers gripped mine tighter for a moment, his breath shallow and labored. But it wasn't enough to change anything. He wasn't apologizing. Not truly. I knew that. I'd spent years learning to live without the kind of love I'd wanted from him, from them. His words were as insubstantial as the breath that left his lungs. But still, I stayed. I had no real reason to. I didn't owe him anything, not after everything. But I stayed. Maybe it was just to see if I could get one last answer to a question I had never asked aloud. I didn't know why I had come. It wasn't out of forgiveness, certainly not out of hope. It wasn't even out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for redemption. I'd stopped looking for that years ago. It was the phone call that brought me here. I remember the moment clearly. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the screen of my laptop, waiting for a message that would never come. The hum of the city outside was like background noise to my thoughts, as it always was. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. I didn't even hesitate before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was shaky, almost as if they weren't sure how to speak to me. A stranger, but not really. The voice was familiar, as much as it made my skin crawl. It was my aunt, the one who had once been my mother's closest ally. The one who was always a little more supportive, a little more accepting. The one who used to tell me, "It's not that we don't love you, we just don't understand you." But she wasn't calling with an apology. No, this time, she was calling with news I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "Your father's in the hospital," she said, her voice tight. "It's serious. Your mother's here, and she's asking for you." There it was. The moment that should have felt like a bomb going off in my chest, but instead, it was almost anticlimactic. I didn't feel the weight of anger or disbelief, just a quiet, resigned acceptance of something that had always lingered in the back of my mind. Eventually, they would need me. They always did. But by then, I wouldn't be the person they wanted. "Are you asking me to come?" I asked, voice steady, despite the emotions roiling inside me. She hesitated. "I think you should. It's time, you know?" I had no idea what that meant, but I wasn't going to ask. Instead, I just said, "I'll be there." I didn't expect much, certainly not an apology, but I came anyway. It was a slow walk back into their world, a world that had never really been mine. When I was younger, I'd always hoped that somehow they would change their minds. I wanted them to understand me, to accept me, to love me, but that had never been their way. The day I came out to them, I remember it as though it was carved into my brain. I was 18, standing in the living room of the house I grew up in, my hands trembling in front of me. I'd spent months agonizing over how to say it, how to make them understand. I wasn't sure I was even ready to say the words, but the pressure of holding them in was unbearable. "I'm gay," I had finally blurted out, my voice barely above a whisper. It was all I could manage, but it was the truth. The truth I had carried with me all those years. There was a long silence, the kind that swallows everything. My mother's face had turned pale, her lips trembling. My father? He had looked at me like I was a stranger, like something in me had broken, something irreversible. The disappointment was clear in his eyes. "We don't," my mother started, but she couldn't finish the sentence. My father took over. "This is not who we raised you to be," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're not our son anymore." The words hung in the air, suffocating. I tried to explain, tried to make them understand, but nothing worked. They told me to leave, to get out. They didn't want me in their house. They didn't want me in their lives. I stood there frozen as the door slammed behind me. The last sound I heard from them was their rejection. Final. Definitive. I left that day with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart heavy with sorrow. But I had learned quickly that sorrow couldn't help me survive. It couldn't pay bills or keep a roof over my head. So I did what I had to do. I worked odd jobs, found people who didn't judge me for who I was, and built a life for myself. It wasn't easy, but I did it. And along the way, I learned that I didn't need their approval. I had built my own worth, brick by brick, even if it was without them. But now here I was, standing in the sterile, dimly lit hospital room, watching my father take his final breaths. He didn't know the man I had become. He didn't know the strength I had found in my own solitude. He didn't know the life I had built without him. He didn't know that he had no power over me anymore. As I watched him struggle to speak, my mind drifted back to that day, to the moment when everything had changed. I hadn't expected to forgive him, but somehow in this moment, I realized that forgiveness was irrelevant. There was nothing left to forgive. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of peace I had been looking for all along. The hospital room felt colder than it should have. The sterile smell, the quiet hum of machines, the soft click of the door opening and closing. Everything felt so distant. I wasn't sure if it was the coldness of the room or the chill of years of absence that weighed on me, but I felt as if I was stepping into a world that wasn't mine anymore. My mother was sitting at his side, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked fragile, like she was already breaking into pieces. The years had been unkind to her. She had aged, and not in a way that seemed natural. There was something hollow in her expression, as if she had lost something and hadn't realized what it was until now. She didn't look up when I entered. Her gaze stayed fixed on my father's face, her eyes red and tired. There was no welcoming smile, no outstretched arms. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. I just stood there waiting for something that I wasn't sure would come. It wasn't long before my father stirred. His frail body shifted beneath the thin hospital sheets, and I could hear his breath coming in shallow gasps. His eyes fluttered open, and the recognition in his gaze hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I thought he might say something, anything, to acknowledge me. Something more than the hollow words of love he had whispered earlier. But all he did was blink. His lips parted, but only a raspy whisper came out. "You came." I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say. How do you respond to a man who had cast you out, who had rejected you completely, only to call on you when it was too late? I didn't need to answer. I had nothing left to say to him. But my mother, sitting there next to him, took a deep breath and slowly stood up. She looked at me, her eyes full of unshed tears, but her expression was more resigned than anything else. She wiped her face quickly, then turned to my father. "Do you want to talk to him?" she asked softly, her voice almost too soft, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might make everything collapse. My father's eyes didn't leave me. The machine next to him beeped in irregular intervals, and the sterile light flickered slightly as if it were struggling to keep the room from being too dark. My heart twisted, but I wasn't sure why. Maybe because there was no anger left in me, not anymore. Or maybe because, after all this time, I still wanted something from them, something I knew I would never get. "I don't know what to say," he rasped, his voice cracking. I never thought this would be the way things ended." I didn't respond. I just stood there watching him. My mind drifted back to all the years I had spent building a life without him. Years where I had been forced to become stronger than I ever thought I could. Years where I had learned that I didn't need their love, their approval, that they could break me, but only once. After that, I built my own foundations. But here I was, standing in front of the man who had left me out in the cold, asking for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I'm not here for you," I finally said, my voice low, steady. I was surprised by how calm I felt. "I'm not here for any apology. I don't need you to fix anything. You can't." He didn't respond. My mother, on the other hand, let out a soft sigh. She looked at me as if trying to read me, trying to find some trace of the boy she had lost. But I wasn't that boy anymore. The man in front of her was someone she could barely recognize. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. I just didn't know how to handle it. I didn't understand. I didn't know if she was talking to me or to herself. Her words didn't feel real, just a repetition of the same things she had said to me over the years, words I had long since stopped believing. They were the same excuses, the same guilt that she had carried with her for so long. They meant nothing now. I nodded once, acknowledging her words, but I didn't speak. What was the point? I had learned a long time ago that the past couldn't be rewritten, that the things they had done to me couldn't be undone by a few whispered apologies or regretful stares. And yet part of me, some deep, buried part, still wanted to hear something. I wanted to hear that they understood, that they regretted their actions, that they realized how much they had broken me. But I didn't ask. I didn't need to anymore. My father's eyes were closing again. His breath was slowing, becoming more labored. He wasn't going to last much longer, I could tell. The machines beeped steadily, and I could hear the rasp of his breath. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But there was no room for pity in my heart anymore. Not for him, not for them. I'm here, I said quietly, but that's all I can give. I could feel my mother's gaze on me, but I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. There was nothing left for me to give. There was no resolution, no grand moment of closure, just the slow ticking of the clock and the knowledge that things would never change. As the minutes passed, I stayed by their side, watching my father's breathing grow more erratic. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing moment, and in that silence I realized that I had already moved on. I had already built everything that they hadn't given me, everything they had taken from me. Their rejection had shaped me, yes, but it had also forged something far stronger than anything they could ever offer. I wasn't here for their redemption. I wasn't here for an apology. I was here because I had nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. And in the end, that was the kind of strength I would carry with me, the kind that couldn't be undone. The days after my father's death blurred together in a haze of formalities and an overwhelming sense of detachment. The funeral came and went, a cold affair with little warmth beyond the few people who showed up. Most of the relatives stayed away as expected. They hadn't cared about my father in years. His rejection of me had sealed their fate with him. And I, of course, had been a stranger to them for so long. It was almost fitting that in the end, only the people he had once turned his back on were the ones who remained. When the time came for the reading of the will, I didn't know what I expected. Part of me braced for disappointment, for a final rejection, the closure of a door that had never been opened properly. The other part, the one that had built a life far from them, felt indifferent. It didn't matter. What did it really matter if I inherited anything? The inheritance I had gotten from them was already spent in the form of pain, rejection, and the need to build myself from the ground up. They didn't owe me anything. I had worked for everything I had. Yet as I sat in that room with my mother and the attorney, the tension was palpable. The lawyer, a man I had never seen before, was the one who had called me. He looked professional, but his eyes flickered nervously between me and my mother. It was almost as if he wasn't sure where I fit in this picture. After a few uncomfortable minutes, he finally began. As per the wishes of the deceased, the estate has been divided among a number of beneficiaries, he began, his voice flat, devoid of any real emotion. I already knew how this would go. My father had been pragmatic in life. He didn't have room for sentimentality, for affection. He had shut me out and replaced me with his own pride, his own bitterness. I had accepted that. But when he started reading off the names, it hit me harder than I expected. To his brother Thomas, a portion of the estate, amounting to, he paused to read the figures, $3 million. He moved on quickly to others, his second cousin, his business partner, and then a cold slap in the face. And to his wife, Eleanor, and their children, the remainder of the estate, including the family home and all other assets. I couldn't even bring myself to look at my mother. She sat there, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, her face ashen and unreadable. She hadn't fought for me then, when it mattered. Why would I expect her to stand by me now? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, and I felt a brief flicker of contempt rise inside me. He had done his job. He had read the will. He was finished. "There is a final clause," he continued, his voice softer now as though he were bracing for the fallout. I didn't know why I felt a surge of irritation at his tone, as if he were trying to spare me. "A charitable donation to—" I didn't hear the rest of his words. My mind was already drowning in a sea of anger and disbelief. There was nothing for me, not even a token, not even a thought given to the son who had been cast aside. And yet I wasn't surprised. Not really. What had I expected? For my father to come to his senses on his deathbed and offer me something to mend the years of hurt, to make up for the pain, the years of loneliness and abandonment? The estate, the money, the home. It all belonged to people who had stayed. The family who had never once questioned what they'd been told. The people who had never needed to understand me. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. I didn't need it. I didn't want it. What had been taken from me could never be replaced by money. "You can leave it all to them," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't need it." The lawyer nodded quickly, almost relieved. My mother sat motionless beside me, not meeting my eyes. But I could feel the weight of her silence more than I could feel anything else. She had never stood by me, never fought for me, and yet, in her eyes, I could still see a flicker of regret. It didn't matter now. It was too late. That evening, as I left the lawyer's office, the weight of the situation settled into my chest, but strangely, I felt lighter. I didn't need their inheritance. I had already built my life, a life where I was free of their shadow, a life where I had nothing but my own achievements, nothing but my own strength. I walked out into the cool night air, the wind brushing against my face. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was an odd peace, the kind that comes when you realize you have finally freed yourself from something that had been holding you back. I didn't need to take anything from them. I had everything I needed. The months after the reading of the will were uneventful. I settled back into my routine, my life as it had been before all of this. The absence of my parents was no longer an open wound. It had long ago scarred over, becoming a part of who I was, a part that had been necessary for my growth. I had often wondered if I would ever be tempted by the prospect of revenge, some grand gesture to make them regret their choices. But I had learned over the years that revenge wasn't always a loud, dramatic affair. It didn't require a public shaming or a moment where they would feel the sting of their actions in the same way I had. No, my revenge was quieter, more powerful, more righteous. The truth was, I had everything I needed. The career I had built from scratch, the friends who had become my family, a peaceful home, and a life filled with purpose. I had surpassed the people who had tried to make me feel small, and I had done it all without their help. And that in itself was the most delicious form of revenge. But there was something more, something final. One afternoon, a year after the will reading, I received a letter. It wasn't from my family. I had heard nothing from them, not a single word of apology or acknowledgement. It was from the lawyer who had handled my father's estate. He informed me that my father's business records, files, contracts, and digital data had been transferred to an offshore account, as per my father's wishes, to ensure that the business would continue without disruption. I didn't give it much thought at first. It seemed like a piece of administrative bureaucracy, something that didn't affect me. But the letter contained a small detail that caught my attention. My father's business, his legacy, was built on something that he never had the courage to tell me: a series of unethical deals, questionable practices, and hidden financial troubles. And in his final days, in an attempt to protect it all, he had tried to cover up his tracks. I sat with the letter for a long time, feeling that familiar spark of realization, a recognition that I had been presented with an opportunity. The things my father had built, the empire he thought would last forever, was fragile. His legacy, one he had tried to protect from his own son, was hanging by a thread, and I could be the one to cut it. I didn't make a decision immediately. The idea gnawed at me for weeks. Should I take this knowledge and use it? Should I expose him, drag his name through the mud? Should I make sure that his business, his entire life's work, was torn apart in the same way he had torn apart my own existence? The thought of it was tantalizing. But then I remembered what I had built. I had become someone without needing to destroy anyone, without needing to lower myself to the level of the people who had wronged me. I had taken everything from the ashes of my past and turned it into something beautiful, and they could never take that away from me. So I did what no one expected. I didn't expose my father's secrets. I didn't tear his business apart. Instead, I bought it. Using the knowledge I had gained, I navigated the legal complexities and purchased the very company my father had left behind. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once turned his back on me, the one who had tried to ruin my life, had left behind a legacy that I could now control. But I didn't stop there. I made sure the company prospered, but I removed the unethical practices that had plagued it. I built a reputation for integrity, for doing business the right way. It was a quiet, subtle victory that no one could see, except for me. My revenge wasn't in public shame or revenge-fueled spectacle. It wasn't in petty gestures that would have only made me as petty as they were. My revenge was in becoming everything they had tried to prevent me from being. My father had thought that by disowning me, he could take away my future. He thought that by shattering me, he could build something better. But in the end, it was me who built something lasting. I left the past behind. I took what had been left to me, the pieces, the lessons, the scars, and turned them into something that would last far longer than my father's name ever would. I stood on the balcony of my office one evening, looking out over the city. It was a moment of quiet reflection, the kind I rarely allowed myself. I had achieved everything I wanted. I had overcome the darkness of my past and built a future that was mine, that no one could take away from me. And as I watched the city below, I smiled, because in the end, my revenge had been the sweetest of all.